Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where in the world you are. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome you all to what I know will be an exciting session in the Modelling World International Program. We have a superstar lineup today joining us to discuss a topic that everyone around the world is discussing, and that's COVID. More specifically, the panellists today will share their thoughts and research on the opportunities and challenges that COVID presents for transport planning and modelling. My name is Catherine Liddell, your chair today, and by title, I'm a principal consultant at Beach Lister Consulting, who are the proud sponsors of this event. I'm an urban planner, although I've worn many hats in my career, from being a business advisor through to a technology consultant. Before we start, for those new to hop in, there are a number of features that will make this session interactive. First is a chat room, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with, so leave your comments, say hi, etc. And then there's a Q&A tab, which I will be monitoring more closely so that I can pose your questions to our speakers. So please do use them. So who are our esteemed panellists this afternoon? First up, I'd like to introduce Chris Loader, a Melburnian and PT planning professional who is passionate about data visualization. Something I find amazing about Chris is that his successful blog, chartingtransport.com, which I know many of my VLC colleagues read, is something he does in his spare time. So I'm certainly curious as to how long his list of achievements is in his main role with the Victorian Public Service. Our next panellist is one of those people whose short bio requires significantly more time culling than writing. It's Professor Graham Currie, Director of the Public Transport Research Group at Monash University. Graham is a transport celebrity, if there ever is one, with over 40 years' experience in transport modelling and research across the world. Just last year, Graham picked up the prestigious Australian Transport Medal by Engineers Australia. Last and never the least, we have Professor David Hensher. By title, he is the founding director of the Institute of Transport and Logistics Studies at the University of Sydney. As any diligent chair would do, I quickly scanned David prior to this session and found the best introduction for him, which read, Professor David Hensher is nothing if not prolific in his output. So no doubt the author was referring partially to his 690 papers in international journals and 16 books. So thank you to Chris, Graham and David for joining me today. The format of this session is pretty straightforward. We will have a short 8 to 10 minute presentation from each of our panellists before we kick off our discussions. Chris, I want to hand it over to you first to kick off for today.
Thank you, Catherine. Just putting my slides up. Thank you and good morning, good afternoon, wherever you might be in the world. I'm Chris Loader, as just been introduced. I'm going to focus in my presentation on some of the emerging evidence around travel behaviour in Australia so far and some analysis, and I think that'll be a great lead into Graham and David, who will look into some of their research that's been going forward. I guess one of the major themes I'll focus on is public transport, working from home, and I'll talk a little bit about population growth and different types of population. What I'll be presenting today is very Australian focused, and I hope that's of interest to people outside Australia, as Australia is along with a few other countries, uniquely positioned as we have very little community transmission of COVID-19 and things are returning back to normal, and some cities are ahead of others. New Zealand is also in that boat, along with a few other countries. So on public transport, one thing that's been quite clear in Australasian cities is that public transport has been very slow to recover from the lockdowns that we had. This chart here is showing Melbourne public transport patronage, the trains, trams and buses. We had our first lockdown in April, May, and then we had a second wave through mainly the July, August timeframe where we're all working from home and various shops were closed, etc. And then we've sort of been on a recovery trajectory since then, and since late last year, there's been only a trickle of local cases in most states in Australia. And so there has been a gradual recovery through here. A little bit of noise in the data here. I'm comparing it to baseline, but you can see our trains are at about 55%, our trams are about 45%. They are very much focused on the central business district. Our buses are recovering a bit higher. They have a much more suburban focus and probably a lot more school children on those services. Roads around Melbourne and my understanding around most other Australian cities are pretty much back to 100% of 2019 volumes. It's a little bit lower in central Melbourne, in the central city, but generally the roads are back to full, but the public transport is not, which is a really interesting pattern. I've been diving into the figures for some other cities. Sydney's about 60%, Brisbane, depending on how you measure it, 65 to 70%, Perth, which is probably ahead again on suppression of the virus, 76%, and Auckland, which has also had great success, about 75% on public transport. So why is this slow recovery in public transport? I think it's pretty easily largely explained by the occupations that are working from home. So I've looked at the 8 major occupation categories from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and looking at their 2016 journey to work mode shares. And as you can see, professionals, clerical, administrative workers, managers, the sort of professions where people can probably sit on a laptop in their living rooms, as I am now, very amenable to working from home. Those professions had very high public transport use and high working from home use in 2016. So it's probably no surprise those people working from home are significantly impacting on public transport. This chart here just shows you that the workers who I've classified those 3 occupations, they're very concentrated in central business districts and places with very high public transport mode share for journeys to work. So it's not really surprising that there's a massive impact on public transport patronage. Roughly 2/3 of public transport journeys to work in Australian cities were to what you might call central city. I've been a little bit arbitrary about those definitions, but public transport obviously are very focused in Australian cities, at least on the central city elements. I should just point out Sydney has really multiple CBDs. That's just the Sydney CBD. There are others as well. So the working from home is having a massive impact because a lot of these people who normally use public transport are not coming into the city. This is some ABS data, Australian Bureau of Statistics data, looking at working from home for employed persons aged 18 and above across Australia. There was a survey pre-COVID, sort of before March 2020, and then there's been a number of follow-up surveys from September onwards. I should point out, in Australia, all of the major outbreaks, first and second waves, were in between these 2 surveys here. So there would have been probably a much higher working from home had that been surveyed in April or perhaps in July, August in Victoria, at least, where there was a second wave. And you can see here that there's quite significant working from home, significantly more than pre-COVID. And in fact, it's almost slightly increased in terms of people who are working from home. But the number of people who are working home all or most days of the week has been gradually declining. So it's been looking like there's a shift towards working a few days a week in the office and a few days at home, which is something emerging, and a lot of discussion seems to suggest that is a preference for many people. Here are some figures from the Property Council of Australia. They've been surveying their members in terms of CBD building occupancy across time from August until recently. Melbourne is at the bottom of this track. I guess that's less surprising given Melbourne had a very large second wave, which was probably alarmed quite a few people, and there's probably a sense of caution in terms of going back. Sydney didn't have quite as big a second wave, but there have been a few outbreaks in the Sydney area on and off, whereas the other Australian cities doing much better in terms of keeping COVID under control. They seem to have sort of landed at this 60 to 70% office occupancy. The Property Council do say that 92% is about average, so you're not necessarily heading for 100, but they seem to have landed. These cities haven't had much at all in terms of COVID for many months. They're landing at this 60, 70%. So there seems to be a bit of a new normal emerging in those cities. I've just plotted the CBD office occupancy against public transport patronage return. These are for recent figures, mostly March, and you can see the cities, Perth's had the most success, and going down to Melbourne. There's obviously a relationship there. CBD office occupancy doesn't explain all of the public transport trends, but obviously it's a significant part of that, and you can see a fairly clear relationship there. There will be other factors at play, of course. One thing that is of great interest to me, and I'm sure many other people here, is to understand, have people mode shifted away from public transport towards other modes from a sense of infection fear on public transport, if that's what it is. I've had a bit of a look at the Melbourne Central Business District and looked at the available data I could find on the various modes. Vehicle traffic is about 93%, but I should point out that a lot of the traffic through the CBD is actually through traffic. It's not necessarily destined for the central city. A lot of this will, of course, be deliveries and the like. CBD parking prices in Melbourne do appear to be very similar to pre-COVID levels. I don't have a fantastic data series, but anecdotally, the prices seem to be very similar. Curiously, pedestrian traffic in the central city is at about 43%, which is surprisingly low. It's much higher on weekends when people return to social activities, etc. I think part of this may be that the central city in Melbourne has a lot of international students, or did have a lot of international students. A lot fewer of those at the moment. That may explain that. In terms of the trains do the heavy hauling into the CBD, train station exits from our City Loop stations are about 50% of 2019 levels. But in the morning peak, and this was just before the school holidays in late March, we were more like about a third. So it suggests there's a different mix of activity happening in our central city with a lot of office workers working from home. And then we have a bunch of bicycle counters, and these are the ones on the fringe of our CBD, and they're tracking over 50% of normal levels beforehand. That could suggest there's been perhaps some shift towards bicycles relative to the other modes, which is interesting. But it's hard to know without being able to separate these vehicle trips as to which ones are destined for the CBD and which ones are through traffic. It's hard to get a real clear feel for that, and I think this will be something to look at as we go forwards. You're going to see lots of these surveys. This is a survey that was run across May to December 2020 by the Department of Transport in Victoria about opportunities to work from home. Pre-COVID, only sort of about 20% of people had frequent opportunities to work from home. That obviously exploded during the survey period. Some of that survey period will actually be while there was heavy restrictions. Some of that will be when the restrictions were being released. And this is people's expectations about their opportunities to work from home in the future. And there'll be a lot, I know Graham and David will talk a lot about this as well. But I think one thing that's really interesting, and I think this will take some time to emerge, is will employers be happy with their employees working from home? And these are some of the headlines we've had in The Age, which is a Melbourne newspaper. People need to comply, no right to refuse return to office call, the lawyers, and bosses calling in psychologists to coax workers back into the office. Certainly my anecdotal experience in the Victorian Public Service is that people have been a little bit reluctant. They've become very comfortable working from home, and they're kind of being asked more and more. There's been more and more encouragement to come back into the office. The target for the Victorian Public Service is 3 days per week as the new default. So that's a sort of a 60% volume on pre-COVID, which is interesting. So I think it will be very interesting to see how this emerges, whether employees and employers are happy with different levels of working from home. I want to touch on population.
Just 1 minute, Chris, and then we'll move on.
1 minute, yep, just wrapping up. Australia has had a lot of immigration from internationally. That, with hotel quarantine, etc., that has ground to a halt. In fact, there's been more people leaving Australia than arriving in Australia. So that's a big change. But one thing that's interesting in Australian cities is that recent immigrants are much more likely to use public transport, and they actually make up a fairly large proportion of the populations. In Perth, almost 1 in 5 people arrived in the 10 years prior to the census in 2016. So as those people settle themselves down, they might shift towards other modes, and that would be an interesting impact on mode shifts. And another, I think this is my final point, internal immigration. One thing that's happening in Melbourne and many other cities in Australia is that a lot of people have moved from the inner suburbs out to the outer suburbs. Maybe they're starting a family, and they've been replaced by international arrivals. Now, without those international arrivals, are people still going to be moving out to the outer suburbs? What is their motivation? And another question that is too early to answer, is there a decentralisation of population? People say, I'm working from home, I don't care so much about the travel time to the city where I work, if that's where you work, I'm willing to move out. Or do people want to live in the inner city for other reasons? So hopefully that's some interesting snippets of information. Thank you for that. If you're interested in more data stories, you can find my work on chartingtransport.com or Charting Transport on Twitter. So I'll pass back to Catherine.
Thanks, Chris. That was a really good introduction. Graham, I'll pass it over to you now.
Thank you. And here we go. So hopefully you can see that. There seems to be an advert on the screen for some unknown reason. Right. Let me present this. Can you all see that?
Yep, we can see it, Graham.
Okay. Well, I'm going to talk about the future a bit more, and I'm going to address the opportunities and challenges for modelling. You know, what are the problems for modelers? Well, I think the model development process pre-COVID is the same as it is post-COVID. You know, we have travel behavior, we go out there and measure it, we calibrate our transport models, and then we operate them. The problem is with COVID that the travel behavior has changed, and we measure it, and we have to then measure the changes and then recalibrate our models. Actually, I think there's more focus on measurement now because, of course, things have changed, and then we can then go ahead and adjust our models. There are two problems we're facing at the moment, I think, about measurement. The first is globally, I'm really focusing mostly on commuting in my discussion and also on cities. We've had a heck of a lot of studies now. There's 4,237 published studies on COVID and travel and transport, but only about 5 or 6 on cities published so far. And 4 out of the 5 on cities have used online sampling, just pushing it out there. And they're really being used by people who use the internet a lot. And they're they're underrepresented. There's a bias in them in that we're not getting older people and lower income groups. So they're overestimating behaviors like work from home. So there's a bit of a problem. The other key problem is that the behaviors haven't stabilized yet. We know from work like Chris has talked about, we've seen shifts, but there's subtle changes still happening and behaviors are shifting. So we need to address all of these things. We have at Monash, we've done a survey just looking at Melbourne, but we've used a very large sample which is adjusted for typical online sampling bias, underrepresentation bias, by making sure we sample older age groups as well as lower income groups. The other unusual thing about what we're doing is that we are monitoring the sample and asking them why they're changing their behaviors, but also asking them how they think their behavior will change after COVID has gone. So this is a peering into the future about people making their own self-reported expectations. Now, we've found 4 key behavior changes in Melbourne. We think this might be different for different cities, but I'm going to talk about the 4 key ones. Now, there are many other behaviors other than these, but these are the ones we think are large. The first is commute trip reductions. Yes, reductions in commuting as a result from work from home. The second is mode shift from public transport to car driving as a result of infection fear. The third is spatial variations in the above. And the fourth is socioeconomic variations in the above. Let me go through these and show you some data. While you're watching this, you might like to think how you can change your models to represent these. The first is commute trip reductions. Now, on the left there, what you see there is the total amount of commuting before COVID, and then in the red, the commuting after COVID. And that's a 6% reduction. Why do we get that? Well, the middle graphic is during the various phases of COVID, it shows the amount of working from home, which was very high during COVID. But if you look at the shaded bit, that's the post-pandemic after the virus is gone. And as Chris's data implies, we're going to go back to work, but not everybody. And indeed, there we have a 75% increase in working from home as an average working day. How does that relate to a 6% reduction in commuting? Well, before COVID, we had 4.6% of people working from home. So the increases are pretty much in line with that. Secondly, mode shift from transit to car commuting. On the left, we see the mode share pre-COVID of the various modes in Melbourne as a whole. Plus, I've included working from home as a means of behaviour. And what you see is the shift between pre-COVID to post-COVID as a share of travel. And the biggest shifts, there's actually a lot of shifts going on in mode use, but the biggest ones are from public transport in red to car driving. I've highlighted it at the top there. Now, that's quite a significant shift. Why is it happening? Now, the graphic on the right shows you people's perceptions of public transport, the issues that they're concerned about. And the best way to read the graphic is around the clock, if you like, from midnight. Safety at night is the most important issue, followed by safety during the day, then reliability, then infection fear, and so forth. And the lines in the middle of the radar plot are how the public transport systems perform. And any point in that line closer to the outer edge is very bad performance. And you can see that people thought there are three key issues. Firstly, safety from assault and theft and so forth, still a big issue. Secondly, infection fear, and thirdly, overcrowding. These are the new drivers of behaviour, and they're behind the cause for mode shift. Now, spatial variations is the third behaviour. Now, what we see in this graphic on the left is changes in work behaviours during the various phases of COVID as a share of pre-COVID behaviour. And on the left is CBD workers, on the right is Melbourne as a whole. And there we see on Melbourne as a whole, 75% growth in working from home after COVID's gone. But you see that in Melbourne CBD, a significantly higher volume, because as Chris was quite rightly saying, CBD workers have got the type of jobs where you can work from home. And this plays out in spatial variations of behaviour in that the volume of commuting to Melbourne CBD is expected to reduce by 20% on the left, compared to Melbourne as a whole of 6%. 1 in 5 workers will no longer use Melbourne CBD in the future. Big change. In addition, we've monitored mode shift by regions of Melbourne. We're able to sample separately different regions of Melbourne. Inner Melbourne is the local government areas within, about 5 to 7 kilometres. Middle is the middle suburbs, and the outer suburbs is on the right. And what we see is some very significant mode shift differences. These are all statistically significant between inner, middle, and outer Melbourne. And in particular, inner Melbourne, we see public transport dominates pre-COVID. We see the shift there to car driving, but also from public transport use to walking, working from home, and also bicycle use. If you look carefully, you'll see them. So quite complex shifts in inner areas. And the reason for that is that obviously the distances in inner area make it possible to cycle and also walk the margin, and we're getting shifts away from public transport in those regions. And I might add, inner Melbourne residents are more likely to experience crowding on transit. So it's both an infection fear and a crowding concern, and they're using the alternatives available. Whereas middle Melbourne and outer Melbourne, we've got more conventional sort of Melbourne-wide shifts there from transit to car driving. Not a very positive outcome. Now, lastly, there is another significant shift in the behaviours. This, on the graphic on the left, is the radar plot of the perceptions during COVID of the various concerns about public transport usage. And the pink and the blue shows female and male plots, which are statistically significant of what the issues are. They're significantly different for infection fear. There is much greater concern about infection fear for females, and also for overcrowding. There is also a concern about safety at night and safety during the day. We've always known that, but infection fear is a gendered one. Now, the words on the right, sorry, I've only got words at the moment. What we've done is we've been able to isolate trip reductions because of increased work from home. And we can confirm that while there's about a 6% trip reduction, commute reduction overall for Melbourne, for the city as a whole, for the highest income groups, the reductions are over 20%. Whereas for lower income groups, the lower sort of 2 quintiles, it's only something like 2 to 3%. So what we've got is also an income bias about reductions in commuting. So that's it from me. This is the team. Many thanks to Taro Jean and Laura Aston. If you want to know more about the work, we run the Researching Transit podcast, and episode 5 covered our work, and also our website has some of our more recent results on this. And that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Graham. I'll now pass it over to you, David.
Thanks, Catherine. And Justin is going to put my slides up, and thank you. Just let me say from the very beginning that thank you to Graham and Chris. And I have to say, despite the different emphasis that I'm going to share with you, the general results are very similar to what Graham is suggesting. And I'm not actually presenting the formal econometric models, although one might have, but it's good news that a lot of the socio-demographics that Graham has mentioned, including location variables, are actually highly significant, as you might expect, in a model. And I'm going to share the structure of the models, which I think you need to think about more seriously as we move forward. And the structure that Graham proposed at the beginning is well aligned with what we're doing. It's all about data providing us with a different set of informations about travel behavior, and then how do we actually integrate that into a modeling framework, be it the existing one or an adjustment of the existing one. Next slide, please. So in doing this, I just want to draw your attention to a statement that Tom Van Buren made when he was asking us to think about the focus. And it's a very important one. Can we model with confidence the route from signals via trends to trajectories and ultimately new norms? Well, the answer is we're in that stage of extreme volatility and uncertainty, and anybody that's trying to currently draw a line that we've arrived at a point of stability to revise their models in terms of what's happening as we move out of COVID, and let me say we are still in COVID, we're not post-COVID at all, we don't know when that will be, is that we need to continually to collect data to search for a point in time when we will start to get some stability in the relationships between the socio-demographics, the working from home, the commuting modes, etc. The other two topics, which I'll briefly mention, but will not spend much time on, which also are going to become relevant moving forward, because post-COVID is not just about working from home, it's the whole move towards mobility as a service, and also the switching to green fuels, which in terms of automobiles could actually be a bigger issue than working from home if we're not careful with the way we price them, on the assumption that when battery electric vehicles, be they fuel cell hydrogen or standard battery, are scalable into the market, there's a high chance that they'll be less expensive to purchase, less expensive to use, and all other things being equal, there could be some huge growth in the use of the car unless we rethink the pricing. Not for the talk formally today, but I just wanted to throw those two in. Next slide, please. And just to remind you that the over time tracking is very, very important. And this is a slide based on what we're currently doing across the entire country, of which we are running models and doing data analysis at the city level, as well as at the regional level and at the Australian level. And we started right at the beginning of the pandemic last March, April, and we're currently in wave 4, which is in the field as we speak. And any results I'm going to share with you today are towards the end of last year. But it's very important that we keep tracking, and we're not only interested in what's happening now, but what is likely to happen going forward into the future. And like Graham, we have asked supplementary questions about plans and in terms of travel changes moving forward, as if you like, working as the pandemic starts to decline, we're vaccinated, and there's a reduced risk of using public transport, which is purely perceptual. Next slide, please. Just want to mention to you, our focus has been working with our colleagues at Transport for Main Road in Queensland and Transport for New South Wales and Sydney, with West Australia Department of Transport in a monitoring role, is that we are wanting to ask ourselves, how do we integrate working from home as a legitimate choice in the travel choices? And it's interesting now that I would say, going forward, that we should not talk simply about what mode you use, but what mode versus do you work from home. And we're not only interested in commuting, of course, but we're also interested in what this translates in terms of non-commuting activity, where we know that there have been greater changes in non-commuting activity as a result of having more flexible working hours and times of day and days of the week in which people work. Next slide, please. So this is just a schematic of the sorts of models that we have already estimated towards the end of last year's data for Queensland and New South Wales. And we now would argue from a modelling perspective that you've got to talk about studying 7 days of the week, and we're interested in whether you do not work, whether you work during the day, and if you travel to work, what mode you used and what time of day. The reason why this is important is because our data is suggesting that people who may have just worked 5 days a week pre-COVID are starting to rearrange their working profiles and are often doing some additional hours on the weekends, in addition to what they may have done pre-COVID, in return for lesser hours during the week. This is an important issue because it has a huge impact on the way we study the commuter mode choice decision. And let me suggest to you that the old tradition of taking a typical day from a household travel survey and expanding it up to the week, to the month, to the year is highly questionable and not to be done unless we can show that it makes no difference. Just at the bottom of that slide, just to remind you that there is an interconnection between change in commuting behaviour as a result of working from home and other factors, as well as and how it translates into other trip purposes. Next slide, please. And here's just a little bit more detail. And just like the Victorian study, you have to look at all the modes, including the active modes, where we are noticing quite a significant change in the local suburban area. And we know that that's a consequence of a number of factors, including people working from home and seeking exercise certain times of the day, increased walking in particular. You can't actually buy a bicycle at the moment, they're all sold out. And also the issue of local suburban growth in car use as a result of people being concerned about having their children go to school on public transport. Next slide, please. So we have a very simple model, just to remind you, and I'm only focusing on commuter choice, but it also applies to the frequency of travel and other models within an integrated model system. But for illustrative purposes, I'm focusing on commuter choice to recognise now that we have an additional consideration, which is to do with the utility of not actually working on a day or time of day, or actually working from home on that time of day and day. And it's important that we consider all of them against the utility of commute, because there are new trade-offs being taken between commuting, working from home, and not actually working at times that pre-COVID would have been related to a commuting trip. Next slide, please. I've not given you the equations, but I can tell you that there's sociodemographics are clearly important, as are location decisions. The further away you work from your home, the more likelihood that you'll have more days working from home. We are interested in the number of days working from home, not just the probability of working from home, because that latter one is potentially misleading in terms of planning. And also there are variations, and these are just examples, by the way, of Southeast Queensland, which is essentially the major planning and metropolitan area for Queensland, from the Sunshine Coast down to the Gold Coast, including Brisbane. And there clearly are differences in occupation, in education, and residential location. I'd also like to make the point, in response to Graham's one about online panels versus face-to-face interviews, that online panels are indeed getting better. And also it's worth noting that there are often just as many challenges in getting data from certain sociodemographic groups face-to-face as there is online. But I do take the point, and as long as we quote a sample on the key sociodemographics or do the appropriate adjustment using ABS, then I would suggest that online panels still have a lot of merit. Next slide, please. I thought this would be an interesting one, given this is all about modelling, and that is to look at quite an important result that one often wants to use beyond simply forecasting, and that is the outputs from models that go into economic appraisal or benefit cost. And we know that the major user benefit is the value of time. And so here's just an example slide, please, whereby we had a closer look at the willingness to pay. And I just want to remind you that often models, despite some problems in forecasting reliability, and one can always calibrate them through the constants to reproduce the base, but then they fall apart when you apply them, because the variables in the models that really matter are the ones that you haven't been able to so-called calibrate, because you have no way of knowing. And you just have to trust the values that come out of your models. But elasticities and willingness to pay are often very, very important. Next slide, please. And so this is a very simple equation. It's the only one I've put up here, where the value of travel time savings is a function of not only the travel time, which we've allowed to be a random parameter, so there's heterogeneity in that, but also the number of days you work from home, a person's income, their occupation. In this case, it's a managerial professional dummies, which we all know that that's where most of the working from home impacts are occurring, but not all of them. And the other one, which is very interesting, is concern about public transport, which we've all spoken about. And what's particularly interesting, without going through too much detail, is that the weighted average value of travel time savings drops by about 12% when you allow for the changing profile of working from home. Now, before COVID and during COVID, based on our data, one thing that's really important to get out of this is that the concern about public transport being highly significant did not have a statistically significant impact on the value of travel time savings as a result of changing its level. So the good news is, as more and more people drop their guard about using public transport, we think this result will hold. We'll continue to do this in waves 4, waves 5, and wave 6 until we feel confident that we've got it right. But 12.5% is a massive adjustment in the major economic user benefit. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Just finishing. Next slide, please. So what I just wanted to share with you, the fact is that when you have changes in commuting profiles and working from home, it has an impact on non-work trips, and I just want to show them to you. Clearly, the one on the top is commuting. You know, as you increase the number of days working from home, obviously it goes to zero. I mean, it goes to no commuting at all. But it's interesting to note the slow decline in all socio-demographics. Trip purposes. So as you increase the percentage of days working from home, there is a change, and the actual numerical values are significant, and that's quite a large difference. And clearly, we mustn't ignore non-work related travel. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Just to remind you, next slide, please. So I'm going to skip that one. Next is that what's really important for the model is to think about new endogenous choices, and the very least, working from home is now a legitimate choice that should be put against the other travel-related choices. Next slide, please. And in order to do this, we've got to rethink the sophistication of our models. The traditional strategic model, which is mostly a 4-step model, which many of you know, is rather limited, with no feedback between location decisions and travel decisions, no relationship between passenger and freight, and no relationship between working from home and travel-related choices. And we need to start building all that in as we move forward. Next slide, please. I'm going to skip this. It was just a little message I had to planners, but often they criticize transport models, but in fact the biggest problems is in the errors in the land use forecasts, and they're the things that planners are responsible for. Next slide, please, and I'm done. Thank you.
Thanks, David. So as we can see, there's a lot of information within the 3 presentations about work from home. So I do want to touch on a few other topics before we deep dive into that. Lending a little bit to what Gavin has asked in our Q&A chat room, we've seen a second wave hit Australia, mainly confined to Melbourne around June of last year, and we have thankfully not had to deal with a third wave. But if we do find ourselves in the unfortunate situation of a third wave or even a 4th or 5th wave, what should we expect from the data we have from countries that have gone through several waves? will we inadvertently be reinforcing or advocating for a car-based recovery the longer that COVID sticks around? Chris, I know that you've had a look at the differences between the first and second wave in Melbourne. What have you observed, and what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so both of the Melbourne waves, we had a very similar response in terms of public transport suppression and road traffic suppression. So it was slightly deeper on this second wave because we had had tighter restrictions during our second wave to eliminate that. So I think it would be really interesting to in a third wave to see how that goes. I think the confidence in the health authorities' ability to suppress a third wave would be part of the infection fear equation for people. Whether it results in people giving up on public transport, I think that would be very interesting. Just an observation on that, I've used public transport in Melbourne, and masks are mandatory at the moment, but mask wearing is evidently down to 50-60%, and patronage is going up, so people seem to be comfortable to return to public transport and not wear a mask. So yeah, there has been a return, but I think it'd be very dynamic. It would very much depend on the circumstances of a third wave.
David, do you have anything that you'd like to add to that?
Not really, other than I think the geographical context is really important. I think you have to be careful. This is one of those classic areas as to how transferable is the evidence going to be globally. And I just think it's too early to suggest that it is. It might be easier with like countries, but I would certainly never want to take the evidence from Australia and use it to guide India or Korea or anything like that. Just forget about it. And I think that's an important point because it's often very dangerous for people to adopt that view, and I think it's risky.
Your mic's on, darling.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, you both mentioned here fear of infection, and it's understandable why people would be wary of catching public transport. But what does the data actually tell us about the spread of COVID on transit systems? In Paris, a recent study found that none of the city's 150 COVID clusters between May and June originated from a city transit system. Similarly, in Japan, researchers failed to connect a single cluster to the country's trains. I recall a webinar a while back, and they said on that webinar that it's the way that the air is filtrated and the fact that people don't talk or mingle on public transport. Some PT advocates are even saying that transit plays a crucial role in fighting the pandemic by reducing the air pollution that makes people more susceptible to COVID. So the question here is there data that we can speak to? And if there isn't a strong link between infection and PT, do governments need to change their messaging about PT use? Graham, I'll throw this one to you.
Yeah. So look, that's right. We now have quite a lot of medical studies who have been able to trace sources. Actually, the first one was in Guangzhou. They did a sample of about 1,000 people, and they were able to trace a source of infection. And one out of 950 people were considered to have got the infection through public transport. My view is none of this matters. Why? Why do I think that? Because perception rules. It's perception that rules behavior, and the population thinks it's important. And as a result, they will change their behavior because of that. Yes, we can try and change their behaviors. I think that'll be influential. One last comment I'd say about infection fear. We've been there before. We actually know all about infection fear. SARS in Taiwan and Hong Kong, infection fear was measured very high levels. In both cases, a phenomenon called residual infection fear, a new word everybody's going to be using, the long-term effect of having a residual infection fear, it was found that it did not exist. There was zero residual infection fear in both Taiwan and Hong Kong. However, in Taiwan in particular, mask wearing on public transport went to very high levels and stayed there after the infection. So I think the issue of whether it's caused by using public transport is useful, and we should be sending messages out there that's not a problem to encourage people to get back. But you can't ignore perceptions of infection fear, and will they last? We don't know. I don't think they will last, and I think we'll see a gradual reduction.
Yeah, and on perceptions, there is a question here from Lindsay who says, does the different perceptions by men and women reflect differences in caring responsibilities in a new work from home environment? What are your thoughts on that, Grant, just to continue?
It's a great question. I don't understand the differences. I understand the differences about safety of public transport use at night, about safety from attack and so forth. And it seems to be there's a macho male view of their ego versus female. I don't know if that also affects infection fear. Frankly, it's a hypothesis if I give you ideas, but what we really need now is evidence. And I don't have any evidence about why yet.
All right, great. Another topic I just wanted to touch through before we get to work from home, CBDs. You know, there's been a lot of talk about reactivating the CBDs, possible transformation of the city centres as a place for experiences, so increased activity geared towards tourism, pubs, restaurants, events, recreation, and so forth. In your opinion, do you think we can reactivate our CBDs back to pre-COVID levels in the near future without reaching the same level of congestion? And should we aim to bring back our CBDs to what they once were? David, I'll throw this one to you first.
Thanks, Catherine. Well, I think it's worth mentioning that the 80% that was cited by Graham, which we've also found, is likely to be the magical number. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's still a huge return to the CBD, but so is 20% drop. And I think the thing that, having followed the property concerns in recent months, is that we're going to be realistic with looking at the remixing of the activities in the CBD. Will this have an impact on congestion? It's not clear, because not all peak hour traffic is commuting related. In fact, in Sydney, nearly half of the peak hour traffic, believe it or not, is non-commuting. So we have to be a bit careful assuming that less people working in the CBD necessarily means less congestion during the peaks. One thing that I still don't have the data, and I'd love someone to tell me, is that with this huge growth in car use, how much of it is actually commuting and how much is something else? One of the suggestions is it is actually parents not wanting to take their children on a bus anymore and driving them to school, as an example. And also the switch with staggered working hours from a passenger in your car to drive alone. We need to know that, because that will guide us as to where the differences are happening and what we could do about it. But, you know, having said that, the relocation of office space into suburbia is a very serious and active issue at the moment. And in fact, many large or medium-sized organizations are seriously thinking about downscaling their lease arrangements and looking for rent by the hour, satellite offices and so on. So that's a land use adjustment. And I might argue that that's not a bad thing, actually. I don't see why we need to all go back to the CBD unless there's a demonstrated evidence that those who have left are going to be far worse off. My hypothesis is they're doing it the other way because they see a benefit.
Yeah, it's a good point, David. On that note, it's been suggested that there is sort of like a happy medium between going back to the office in the CBD full time or working from home. And that's the idea of using local co-working spaces, which seems to have the benefits of shorter commutes, social interaction, and resolving some of those unsuitable work from home arrangements. Co-working spaces, I guess, like work from home, has been around for a while, but it's mainly been utilised by freelancers rather than those who have an office to go to. So do you see there to be in the future a rise in co-working spaces, and if so, enough to make a difference to change the patterns and behaviours of travel from a modelling perspective? Go for it.
I just want to comment, you've only got to talk to Dexus one of the big property, not only developers, but renters to answer the question, yes, yes, yes. I spent a day looking at this with the major property developers and owners, and this is definitely the way they're thinking. It's not even renting by the day, but it's renting by the hour as well, which is fascinating. And you don't all have to be meeting in a location that suits everybody's work residential location. On the odd occasion, they need to get together. They are quite willing to travel further. But I think I'd like to just make one point and pass it on to the others, is that the point that I've always said, and I think Graham mentioned it as well, it's working from home to some extent. It's not a black or white situation, and it will vary by day of the week. And I think that's important. I do believe that employers and employees are quite supportive of that to some extent.
I might just make a comment about suburban working hubs. I think one thing will be really interesting for cities is the mode split that you get to these centres. If parking is a lot cheaper than the CBD and public transport access may not be as strong, it could lead to a lot of car trip generation, which could be a concern. However, if they're hyper-local and people can get to these centres through walking, cycling, etc., then it may go the other way. So it'd be an interesting dynamic to see how these evolve.
Yes,
transport.
The mix of the issues is very complex here. The question is, what's the most important issue? I do think there's a good chance we'll have excess congestion because there's too much shifting to car here. We don't understand it yet, but already there are problems and we're not even at full activity. And that could suddenly become one of the biggest issues. I do agree there can be great outcomes from changes in CBDs. We've had very Americanized CBDs in Australia compared to Europe. Europe has a lot more daytime and nighttime activities, whereas we are very focused on just employment. And I think a shift to a European-style CBD living, we could transition office space to younger people living in inner city areas. That could be extremely more productive for public transport use, for example. Lastly, I'd point out that one of the biggest problems in public transport, because I'm a public transport professor, is actually the peak. We've got tremendously inefficient use of resources because we have to use all our resources in the peak time. And the rest of the day, the transit system is virtually empty. The reduction in the peak that occurs here could give us much more productive use of public transport and improve our cost recoveries. So there's actually quite a lot of good things that could come out of this. But I do think we need to be careful about congestion, and we could be very quickly in a situation where that's starting to dominate Australian cities.
Totally agree, and I would say it's going to be made worse by electric cars, but then the good old road pricing reform surfaces, which politicians don't like. Could I just make a comment on public transport, because I think this is a really important point that's been raised, and that's got to do with the general sense coming out of at least New South Wales, I'm not sure about Victoria, is that as we slowly move out of COVID, despite social distancing on the trains at the moment, and that's being relaxed, the New South Wales government wants to try and avoid a return to crowding. And so there's a serious talk about increasing capacity. And with all the new fancy apps advising you when you can get on a train or a bus and get a seat, we might just do it. And this is an interesting issue because this is, whereas we talk about reducing capacity, this might lead to increased capacity, but the actual journey will be more pleasant. Whether this will happen, I don't know. We could just drop our guard and we get back to the bad old days. We'll have to see.
I had a great chat with Transport for New South Wales last week, and one interesting feature in Sydney compared to Melbourne, which David, your data should show, and I think Chris, some of your journey to work data might show. Of course, Sydney is far more polycentric, whereas Melbourne is such a focus on the CBD. There's virtually no regional centres. And in Sydney, they were very worried that the CBD shift we've seen could affect all of their CBDs. And that's something we should really be looking out for, and would be very different to the European and Asian cities. The pictures in these different cities are going to be very different according to their geography, I think.
Yeah, and I think on that note, while the most impacts are yet to be fully understood, there's the speculation that improved confidence in remote working technology will encourage more regional migration. And to date, I think the speculation is based on indirect evidence such as search trends on real estate websites. Is there other data out there that currently supports this notion? Like, do we know if people will put up with that longer commute time if, say, they only need to do it 2 days a week rather than 5 days a week? Chris, I might throw this one to you first.
I wish there was. I'm not actually aware of some. Graham, David, maybe you know some.
I'm sorry, I can't quote the data. It's just not in my head. But we did ask the question, and we do have a shift, particularly from inner area residents. So all we asked the question, would they consider a shift? And the answer is we did get a shift. I can only tell you that it's not massive, but we do have a number for it. And I'll report that more when I get the chance to get around to that.
If I could just add a little bit more along those lines, I think if there's any evidence from our work, it's not a shift to the regions, but to suburbia in the metropolitan area, but very, very small. And you've got to look at the constraints, because with multi-worker households, it might suit one, but not the other. So you've got to try and tease out which group. Of course, what we also are finding, and some of the estate agents are saying, people are saying, let's go buy a house in the bush. But that's not, they still keep their suburban residence and they just work there more often, but they still have a local one and they commute 2 days a week. So there's too many things we have to tease out. And like Graham, we're starting to ask additional questions to understand that.
Yeah.
I don't think it's going to be a big issue, to be honest, at the end of the day.
I think it's an effect, and I think people are going to overestimate the size of it, and we really need to be able to measure it as a share of everything. I think we'll find, actually, the regions, the regional centres, it'll be very good for them, because actually a small change in the city centre ends up being quite a big number for them. So that's why they're so excited about it. But I think in the context of city modelling, I really wonder if the model's accuracies are going to matter about the scale of it.
I mean, this does call for better data outside of the metropolitan areas as well, although we're sampling nationally and regionally, but nevertheless, there'll come a time when we need much richer data from the more broader population sources on that, I think. I wish the ABS would ask a few more questions in this space.
Yeah,
it's
certainly
really
the internal migration data, unfortunately, won't really be available till this time next year within Australia to see how people have moved.
We should ask them to do something about this. They're quite responsive. That these surveys they're doing, that you quoted, Chris, they're fantastic, really. They're really, really progressive. And I would have thought, together, maybe we should ask them to do stuff about this, because it'll really help us understand that.
Yeah, and on the topic of...
We've got the census coming up very soon. That might have something. It's a pity you've got to wait 4 years to analyse it. That's
Yeah. On the topic of capturing data, I wanted to ask a question that is not as frequently asked as whether people want to continue working from home, and that is, will employers allow their workers to do so? And this may be going a little bit off topic here, but do you see working from home in the future as a privilege, or is it a right? The national employment standards at the moment currently are written in a way where it makes working from home more of a privilege, something that the employers have a lot of control over. And certainly as an employee, if you're strongly encouraged to return back to the office 4 or 5 days a week, you may not have a choice. So there are 2 questions here. One, does that affect the forecasts in any way? And 2, is there a question here of whether governments have a role to play in, cementing or encouraging work from home as part of our future through policy change, as you can sort of see what the Victorian government is doing at the moment, and using this as a lever to solve some of our congestion issues? David, I'll start with you before opening it up to the other speakers.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, I think it's fair to say that because we were forced through COVID into a real world experiment, we got to understand something that we would never understand otherwise about the relationship between the employer and the employee. And what's most surprising, but indeed encouraging, is that many employers have said it's not as bad as they thought. In fact, they quite like it. And they're also, not all, and this is the issue we have to be careful, given the focus on a social license now, which is becoming more and more important, they are starting to say that we need to look at the entire contribution of our employees, of our staff, and that the opportunity to have greater choices and flexibility is something that's becoming higher on the agenda with a hybrid model. So I think there will definitely be a situation where not all, but some organizations will be supportive of this. We know that some are just not interested. They're control freaks, they're power freaks, right? I've seen them in certain organizations, especially some of the big multinationals who just don't trust anybody, with greatest respect. Now, having said all that, I think government should stay out of it, other than make the comment that they think this is something that should be supported. Some have said they should lead by example, and we know TMR have a view, I don't know how current it is, but it was recently, that they want 1 in 4 people at any one time to be in the office only.
Great, and Chris, any other views on that?
Well, you know, we've been studying work from home for a long, long time. The Americans call this teleworking. And the overriding #1 outcome of that research for 20 odd years is it's very hard for people to work from home in practice. It's hard for businesses. And also that you tend to get this behavior at a very small level, very, very small. Pat Mokhtarian is the #1 researcher in the world in this field, in my opinion. And if you read any of her research, you know, she's trying to find where this revolution is occurring. People talk about it being a revolution. Now, almost certainly, work from home is going to increase as a result from COVID. But the starting point for me from a modeling is that you've got to understand that the shifts are not necessarily big in this context of all travel, okay? It's an effect, but it's just not a huge effect. So I think the biggest question that you asked there was what governments want to do. They don't know whether they want to encourage it or whether they want to encourage people to go back to work, frankly. We've been saying for years that as a travel demand management measure, work from home is a fantastic thing to do because it actually reduces the peak. It can be efficient. It can help companies be more efficient. You know, in big events like the Olympic Games, where we need to carry millions of people in cities suddenly, we're trying to encourage it as much as we can. So we can't really resolve what the government wants to do, and we're researchers. Government should do what they want to do, but they're just not being clear about this. We certainly know how to encourage it by making it easier to work from home and with legislation.
Could I just comment on that? Because I think there's an interesting debate here about what Graham is saying. First of all, it's interesting how Pat Mokhtarian, yes, she is the leader, is now coming around as a result of COVID to think about some of the other implications that she had originally disputed as not being revolutionary. I think revolutionary is not the right word anyway. It's sort of, if you like, slow evolutionary, for want of a better word. Having said that, I do think that we're in an environment which we've never been in before, and it's not very helpful to look at pre-COVID and talk about the context because it's changed so much. Whether it will settle back to pre-COVID, I doubt it. But that's not the point. The point is this something that's good for society that all parties that believe there's a benefit should actually work to achieve? And I do think that's worthwhile. The productivity element, which we actually haven't met, is very important. The piece in the Daily Telegraph I had this week generally suggests with great surprise that although you could say over 60% of people that the productivity gain has been almost zero, very little loss, but quite a big increase. It is perceptual. But also what's fascinating is that the mix of people retrofitting their houses to work more efficiently at home and the opportunity for satellite offices is a trend that I think is going to continue. And so working from home is not necessarily working at home for everything, but actually working away from the main office in a location that's more appropriate to your lifestyle. So I think we need to still understand that journey. And I call it a journey because I don't think we're anywhere near that yet.
Yeah, and on that, from a modelling perspective, there's a question here from Stephen. To reflect working from home or working away from the office as a legit choice in our models, do you think that we should reduce work trip rates or perhaps include working from home trips as intrazonal trips for aggregate models? Who wants to tackle that one first?
I'll have a go after.
I have a different view about, you see, a lot of people in the modelling world, and of course this entire conference will be full of people that are in modelling, their job is to try and get better models. And they're always trying to get new models. But in the real world, transport planners are left with the models they've got. They're usually pretty unsophisticated. And that's the way the world is, okay? Well, in my opinion, the way to move forward immediately is just to change the models we've got, which is going to be changing the parameters a little bit here and there. Now, it would be nice to have better structured models. Yes, but you know, how many years is it going to take to get that? I think the game we're in, you know, tactically is changing the parameters today. And we can do that. You know, we can change the value of time of public transport to get a shift. We can do things like that. We can change, as there are two suggestions there from that guy. I thought that they were both good ideas, because I think there's a spatial effect going on here about work from home, and his trick matrix concept would be a way of capturing that.
Yes, and the good news about what we're doing, because we have suggested that we can't just start from a clean sheet and develop a whole new set of models. Let's look at what we've got, and which has been heavily invested in by governments, and see where we can adjust the results to account for the impact of working from home, for example, only at the time when we're confident that the parameters, so that we've got some stability. In terms of the parameters that Graham mentioned, the good news is, having looked at the distributions of travel times and costs, is that the pre-COVID ranges are not dissimilar to the to what we're in at the moment. The biggest issue is crowding. And if you've got crowding in your model, you've got to think that through more carefully. But, you know, you can always recalibrate. What's frustrating, and I can tell you this in both New South Wales and Queensland, I don't know about Victoria, when I ask for the mode shares today for various trip purposes, they don't know. The household travel surveys, for example, there's still circa 2018-19. They're doing new surveys, but so you can't actually recalibrate right now. But what I can tell you is it's not very hard to make adjustments of the trip generation matrix to account for the probability of working from home on a given day by location. It's not just an across-the-board 0.3, but it varies by location, by socio-demographics, and we actually have designed a DSS to do just that for Queensland and New South Wales. And we've shown them how to design a new trip matrix with adjustment factors in each cell. And I think Graham and I would agree, I think we're saying the same thing here, is that let's tidy up what we already have. And I think we must do that, because most of the planners in government agencies will run scared if you tell them to dump their models and start afresh.
An adult point for what I'm a public transport modeler mainly, and a real truth when you look at the world of modeling is there's a difference in public transport modeling between capacity constrained modeling and public transport and non-capacity constrained. And there's bags of 4-step models out there that are not capacity constrained. And that's a big difference for COVID, because you need to understand, as David said, crowding. So suddenly you need to start measuring that, and that might be another factor to add in.
Yeah, some good points there. I don't know about everyone else, but for me, that time just flew, and we're actually getting close to closing soon. So before I thank the speakers and ask for any closing remarks, I wanted to encourage the audience today for everyone to go and visit the exhibitions between the sessions, which you can enter by clicking on the Expo icon within the left panel of your screen. The Expo, it's a casual, great showcase of leading transport modelling capabilities globally, and a chance for you to get a sneak peek at the innovations, leading thoughts of our fantastic lineup of exhibitors. I saw an email this morning about free licenses being offered for software by one of the exhibitors, so definitely worth a look. So Chris, Graham and David, before we wrap up, I did want to give you an opportunity for any closing remarks, and maybe to answer one final question. And I do want to bring it back to one of David's statements that he had on his presentation about models being useful when they can add value to answering questions of relevance to planners and others. What do you believe is or are the key questions that should be of highest relevance, particularly when it comes to planning post-pandemic? I'll start with you, Chris, for your closing remarks.
Yeah, it's been a great discussion. My focus is very much on tracking what is happening in the world, not necessarily a model on myself, but I think there's a few things that we need to keep a close eye on in tracking what is happening out there. I think from working from home, we need to be looking at the geography of those behaviours in terms of workplace, not necessarily just from where people live and through occupations as well. And I think it's also important that we keep a close eye on the infection fear element. Is this something that is evaporating as people go, oh, it's all normal, I'm over it, let's go back to normal, or is it something that sticks? I think that's something we need to look at quite closely. I guess the big feeling for me is that, as the other speakers have said, this is a very much an evolving situation. There's a lot of dynamics involved. And we may reach a situation where most people are returning to the office and those who are working from home have a fear of missing out, and so it might flip everyone back into the office, or we could end up with a stable hybrid model. It's hard to know exactly how that's going to land. So I think I guess my message would be that there's no clear one scenario of the future, and it's probably a good idea to be thinking about high, medium, low scenarios, as modelers often do.
Yeah, great. David, I'll throw to you for your closing remarks.
Yeah.
And just that question.
I was going to say all of the above there, but I have to say that I think the crucial thing is that we've got to continue collecting data because everything's so volatile and uncertain. And I think that data will help us to inform what are going to become the key policy levers associated with the extent to which existing models can actually provide useful results or not. And as I finish, I'd like to just say that I think everything we've been talking about, generally speaking, has been a positive unintended consequence of COVID. And we mustn't lose the opportunity to use the data, sometimes more than the models, but in conjunction if necessary, to make sure that the next generation of people are going to get a benefit out of it rather than just us.
Yeah, good point. Graham.
So what's the question? The question was, what question should we be asking? Well, that takes us right back to what's important about how we run cities and the COVID situation, I think. Well, we're in a bad situation, aren't we? The economy is not working the way it should do, and we need to sort that out. So I think recovery is the question. As transport modelers, we've got a responsibility to make sure we make the right investments. So, Australia, certainly Victoria's got $80 billion worth of investment it's putting out there. Is that still correct? Our evidence suggests it is. But also, the majority of the world's population since 2007 lives in the cities. And by 2020, that population will double. So this is humanity. We are urbanized. Is it going to work? And we still don't know yet whether these shifts we've seen are sustainable. And, we've been over-relying on car traffic, and the shifts are towards it. So that, to my mind, is our biggest concern, getting public transport back to work in mega cities, which forecast future.
Thanks, Graham. Well, it was my aim to give our audience and panelists 15 minutes of their time back to go have a break before our next session and also visit those exhibitions. So I will close this up a little bit early unless there are any other remarks from our panelists. So finally, I guess thank you to all three speakers for sharing their insights, thoughts, hopes for the future of transport post-pandemic. I've enjoyed myself thoroughly, and I trust that all who have tuned in have also found value in a pleasure in joining us today. So have a wonderful afternoon, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the Modelling World International program.
And great sharing, Catherine.
Well done, Catherine.